Most people say they want to be happy, but their behavior suggests something else. They wake up and search for reasons to suffer, not consciously, but consistently. They talk about stress the way others talk about hobbies. They describe their lives through pain. They introduce themselves through struggle. This is not accidental. For many people, suffering. Most people say they want peace, but their lives are organized around suffering. They wake up and describe themselves through pain. I'm stressed. I'm tired. My life is hard. Their suffering is not just something they experience. It becomes who they are. Marcus Aurelius warned about this kind of thinking. He wrote that the mind shapes its own reality, not by what happens, but by how it judges what happens. If a person believes their suffering defines them, then removing suffering would remove their identity. This is why many people unconsciously resist solutions. They don't only want relief, they want recognition. Suffering provides moral status. It makes them feel important. It justifies their failures. It explains why they haven't changed. The Stoics noticed something disturbing about the human mind. You'd rather complain than act, because action requires responsibility, and responsibility removes excuses. Marcus said that people suffer more from their opinions than from events. Two people lose the same job. One adapts, the other collapses. The difference is not the event. It is a story they tell themselves about it. To suffer is passive. To improve is active. And most people prefer the comfort of passivity. Suffering demands nothing from them. Change demands discipline. This is why people protect their pain. They repeat it. They display it. They build their personality around it. Marcus called this mental slavery, being ruled by emotional habits instead of reason. From a Stoic view, suffering becomes attractive because it allows a person to avoid the hardest task of all, self-governance. And when suffering disappears, so does the illusion that life is unfair to them. That is why many people cling to it. Seneca once wrote, "We suffer more often in imagination than in reality." This statement explains most modern anxiety. People do not suffer only from what happens. They suffer from what might happen, what could happen, what they replay again and again. The mind rehearses pain like a ritual. A single insult becomes a narrative. A small failure becomes a prophecy. A minor loss becomes proof that life is hostile. Seneca believed this was a form of self-harm, not physical, but mental. When pain is imagined repeatedly, it becomes familiar. And what is familiar feels safe. The mind prefers known misery to unknown peace. If a person lets go of suffering, they must confront uncertainty. They must confront responsibility. They must confront themselves. So instead, they suffer in advance. They worry about problems that may never occur. They rehearse humiliation. They anticipate rejection. In doing so, they give suffering a permanent home. Seneca saw this as a misuse of reason. Reason was meant to free us. Instead, it is often used to torture us. The tragedy is that imagined suffering feels productive. It feels like preparation. But it is only paralysis disguised as caution. People believe they're being realistic. In truth, they're being fearful. Stoicism teaches that pain should be met when it arrives, not summoned before it is needed. Yet many summon it daily, not because they must, but because their mind has learned this pattern. They're not addicted to pain itself. They are addicted to the certainty pain provides. If you expect suffering, you're never disappointed. And so suffering becomes a habit, a ritual, mental comfort. Seneca believed freedom begins when we stop rehearsing misery, but most people never stop. Epictetus said that people are disturbed not by events, but by their judgments about events. This is a dangerous idea, because if suffering comes from judgment, then suffering can be altered, and that means blame must disappear. Most people do not want that. Blame is comforting. It provides direction for anger. It removes responsibility. When something goes wrong, they say, "The world is unfair. People are cruel. I was unlucky." Epictetus divided life into two categories: things we control and things we do not. Most suffering comes from confusing the two. People try to control reputation. They try to control outcomes. They try to control other people's behavior. When they fail, they feel wronged. But this suffering is manufactured. It is the pain of false expectations. Stoicism does not remove hardship. It removes the illusion that hardship should not exist. People secretly enjoy suffering because it allows them to blame the world instead of confronting their own judgments. It is easier to say, "Life is against me," than to say, "I misjudged reality." Blame protects the ego. Discipline challenges it. Epictetus believed that freedom comes from mastering internal reactions, but most people prefer emotional indulgence. They repeat stories of injustice. They nourish resentment. They preserve grievances, not because it helps them, but because it explains their stagnation. Suffering becomes a shield against self-exe. Most people do not suffer in silence. They perform it. They announce how tired they are, how stressed they are, how overwhelmed they are. Suffering has become a language, a way to communicate worth. In many social environments, peace is suspicious. If you are calm, people assume you're detached. If you're content, people assume you're privileged. But if you're exhausted and anxious, you're seen as hardworking, responsible, and real. Marcus Aurelius warned against this instinct. He wrote that people confuse activity with virtue and emotion with importance. To the Stoics, a calm mind was a sign of discipline. To modern culture, it is often seen as indifference. This creates a strange incentive. People exaggerate their suffering because it makes them appear meaningful. Pain becomes proof of effort. Stress becomes proof of responsibility. Burnout becomes proof of dedication. So suffering turns into social currency. But once suffering becomes valuable, peace becomes dangerous. Because if you are not suffering, you must explain why. You must justify your calm. You must defend your stability. You must appear busy even when you are not. Marcus believed this was a form of self-betrayal, living according to other people's expectations instead of according to reason. He wrote that the mind should not be enslaved by the noise of the crowd. Yet, most people measure themselves by the reactions of others. They complain publicly. They dramatize privately. They build narratives around hardship because hardship attracts attention. But attention is not understanding, and validation is not wisdom. The Stoics believe suffering should be addressed quietly through discipline, not performance. Modern life encourages the opposite. It rewards visible distress and ignores silent self-control. So people learn a pattern. If I suffer, I am seen. If I heal, I disappear. Over time, the mind adapts. It no longer seeks peace. It seeks recognition. And suffering becomes a tool for that. Marcus would say this is not strength. It is dependence, depending on external approval for internal stability. And once suffering is rewarded, It becomes repeated, not because it is necessary, but because it is useful. The tragedy is that peace no longer feels valuable to those who profit from pain. They would rather be admired for struggling than unnoticed for being free. And so, suffering becomes a performance. There is a hidden advantage to suffering. It removes responsibility. When someone says, "I am miserable," they do not have to explain why they have not changed. Pain becomes a shield. Epictetus taught that freedom begins when a person separates what is in their control from what is not. But most people blur this line intentionally. They blame circumstances for habits. They blame history for behavior. They blame others for decisions. Suffering becomes their evidence. They say, "Look at what happened to me. Look at what I endured. Look at what I lost." And because suffering feels involuntary, it feels innocent. But Epictetus would say, your interpretation is voluntary. Your judgment is voluntary. Your reaction is voluntary. To suffer is easy. To adjust is difficult. So many choose the easier role, the wounded observer. They do not want solutions. They want explanations. Explanations preserve identity. Solutions destroy it. If a person heals, they lose the story that justified their stagnation. So they remain loyal to their suffering, not consciously, but consistently. Epictetus warned against emotional indulgence. He believed emotion should be examined, not obeyed. Yet most people treat emotion as authority. They say, "I feel hurt, therefore I am right. I feel angry, therefore someone is guilty. I feel broken, therefore I cannot act." Feeling becomes law. But Stoicism rejects this. It says feelings are signals, not commands. The danger is that prolonged suffering becomes comfortable. It gives structure to thought. It gives direction to blame. It gives reason to remain unchanged. And so suffering becomes a resting place. Epictetus would call this a misuse of the mind, turning pain into a refuge instead of a problem to be solved. True Stoic discipline is not denial, it is correction. But correction requires admitting that suffering is not always imposed. Sometimes it is chosen, not because people want pain, but because they want exemption. Exemption from growth, exemption from risk, exemption from responsibility. And so suffering becomes a role, a position, a story. It says, "I am not stuck. I am wounded." And that sounds nobler. But Epictetus would say that nobility comes from mastery, not misery, from judgment, not complaint. Yet most people prefer the dignity of pain to the effort of discipline. And so they remain where they are. When people lose meaning, they search for suffering. Pain gives structure to emptiness. If life feels directionless, suffering gives it shape. Seneca believed that humans fear purposelessness more than pain. Pain at least feels significant. It feels like something is happening. It feels like life has weight. So when meaning disappears, people replace it with hardship. They say, "My life is difficult. My mind is heavy. My world is cruel." And this gives them a narrative. Seneca warned that suffering can become a substitute for purpose. He believed that reason should guide desire. But in the absence of direction, desire attaches to distress. The mind needs tension. If it does not get it from ambition, it gets it from anxiety. So people worry intensely about trivial things. They dramatize ordinary setbacks. They inflate small conflicts. They cling to emotional storms because stillness feels empty. Modern life intensifies this. Constant stimulation removes silence. Silence reveals confusion. Confusion demands escape, so suffering becomes noise. It fills the space where purpose should be. Seneca taught that a person must choose their burdens wisely. Not all suffering is equal. Some suffering builds, some only distracts. But most people do not choose. They inherit their pain from habit and environment. They repeat worries they learned. They mirror emotions they saw. They borrow distress from others. And this borrowed suffering feels personal. It feels earned. Yet Seneca would say that unnecessary suffering is a failure of philosophy. Philosophy was meant to simplify the mind, not burden it, to clarify values, not multiply anxieties. But many people reject simplicity because simplicity exposes them. Without suffering, they must decide what they stand for, and that is harder than complaining. So suffering becomes their compass, not pointing toward truth, but away from responsibility. Seneca believed that a disciplined mind creates its own meaning, but most minds prefer inherited chaos, because chaos requires no commitment. Meaning requires choice, and choice is frightening. So they keep their suffering. They protect it. They nurture it, not because it feels good, but because it feels like something. And in a world without direction, something painful is easier than nothing at all.